It is my great pleasure to introduce a friend, Allison Rudnick. Allison Rudnick is an associate curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her exhibition, The Art of the Literary Poster, works from the Leonard Lauder Collection, opens at the Met on March 7th. And she recently organized Art for the Millions, American Culture and Politics in the 1930s, which was on view at the Met in the fall of 2023 during our October fair. Hopefully you caught that. Prior to joining the museum, she worked at the print shop and publisher Harland & Weaver, and she has published and presented widely on modern and contemporary printmaking practices and visual culture. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Allison.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Well, thank you, Jenny, for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to present to you all today. Thanks to Michelle and the rest of the IFPDA staff for their fantastic work on managing the events at the print fair. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to present on the American art posters from the Leonard A. Lauder Collection at the Met today in anticipation of an upcoming book on the topic, which will be out in just a few weeks, and a related exhibition opening at the Met, as Jenny mentioned, on March 7th. The book and exhibition celebrate an outstanding collection of posters that began with a donation by Mr. Lauder to the museum in 1984, so exactly 40 years ago. And since then, he has continued to devote time, energy, and expertise to adding to the collection, which today numbers at over 500 posters. I'd like to express my deep gratitude to Mr. Lauder for his generosity and commitment to the museum, as well as to Emily Braun, the curator of Mr. Lauder's collections. I'd also like to thank my many current and former colleagues at the Met who have worked on the collection in various capacities over the years. Now, the parameters of this poster collection are fairly specific. They consist of posters made in the United States in the 1890s or shortly after that advertise magazines, newspapers, and books, which today we call literary posters. These posters are historically important because they represent the first major art poster movement in the United States. In other words, these posters were the first to resemble artworks more closely than advertisements, akin to the way in which late 19th century posters by French artists like Toulouse-Lautrec or Jules Charest, advertising the Moulin Rouge, for example, were so novel for their artistry. The art poster movement in the US all started with the poster we see here, an advertisement for the April 1893 issue of Harper's by the artist Edward Penfield. Penfield, who ran the art department at Harper's & Brothers, was tasked with creating a poster that would attract attention for being unlike anything else out there. He was busy. He was the art director of Harper's, and so he allegedly stayed up all night one night creating this. And it's widely considered today to be the first ever literary poster. Now, it can be difficult to appreciate what was so novel about Penfield's design until you compare it to the kind of posters that people would have been used to seeing at the time. So here on the left, the example we see here, it's an advertisement for P.T. Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth. It's a kind of typical circus poster that would have proliferated during the 1880s and early 1890s in cities across the United States. And it exemplifies these posters in its busy, kind of segmented composition and its abundance of text. And by comparison, Penfield's poster is notable for its bold simplicity of its imagery, and the only text that it contains are the words Harper's for April. And this was really novel. There's no other text announcing, for example, the contents of the magazine, the year isn't published on it. It's very sparse. In addition, the text and image are integrated in Penfield's poster into one composition rather than fragmented. And that's something that was enabled by new printing technologies. So the ways in which the circus poster, for example, was printed, it was using two techniques, in this case, lithography and likely letterpress, so the text and the image are segmented, whereas with Penfield's poster, it's all the lettering and the image is all part of one cohesive composition. And Penfield seems to have really relished in the possibilities of this new technology by overlapping the A in Harper's with the man's head. And on this note, something else that distinguished Penfield's designs from the posters that came before it is their playfulness and their humor. The message of this poster seems to be that even in the pouring rain, this man is, hooked on his latest issue of Harper's. The rain's not deterring him. And the presence of rain in this poster is, of course, a witty reference to April showers. So there's some playfulness going on here. Penfield went on to design a poster for each monthly issue of Harper's for the next 6 years. And here we see a selection of examples of posters that he made from 1894 and 1895 in what we consider to be his signature style. The posters were immensely popular with the public. And while much of their appeal can be attracted to their wit and humor, as I just mentioned, their simplicity enabled them to effectively communicate a clear and direct message to viewers. So in that sense, they were very successful as advertisements. The popularity of Penfield's Harper's posters inspired competing publishers around the country to commission similar ads promoting their own magazines, newspapers, and books. Joseph Gould, whose poster we see here, was one of several artists who took cues from Penfield in designing similarly bold, minimalist compositions. Gould illustrated a poster for each monthly issue of the magazine Lippincott's from late 1895 to mid-1897. And like Penfield's designs, Gould's also featured people reading, clutching, or carrying an issue of the magazine being advertised, which was a strategy that both served as product placement and suggests the educated status and intellect of the figure. So in this particular example, the woman holding an issue of Lippincott's against the handlebars of her bicycle, she's a clear representation and would have been understood as such at the time of the so-called new woman of the progressive era. She is tall and lean with light skin, upswept hair, and delicate facial features. So she's manifesting the period standards of idealized beauty. At the same time, in Paris, artists like Jules Cheret advertised the venues and events that made up Parisian nightlife by picturing lively, ebullient women, many of them celebrities of cabaret, opera, and other popular forms of entertainment, whose energy is complemented by a bright color palette and playful typefaces, as seen in the example here at left. The joie de vivre and blatant sex appeal of these performers stand in sharp contrast to the respectability and reserve conveyed by Gould's cyclist at right. The cyclist projects an air of independence and cool detachment, also associated with the new woman. And the contrast in approach between these two might be explained by the difference in target audiences at play. While Cheret's poster sought to attract the male gaze, Gould and his American contemporary sought to appeal to the sophisticated tastes of the magazines of Lippincott's readership, which was, importantly, composed of both men and women. American poster artists' knowledge of printmaking techniques varied widely, and some would simply submit drawings to a printer to be reproduced using photomechanical methods, while others were more deeply involved in the printmaking process. At the Met, we recently acquired this study, which you see at the left, for Penfield's poster for the April 1894 issue of Harper's that provides insights into the artist's methods. The study is a near one-to-one rendering of the finished design, and since Penfield was in a unique position, being both the designer of the poster and the artistic director at Harper's at the time, where both the designing and the printing took place, he likely collaborated very closely with the printers in translating his design into a lithograph primed to be executed in multiple copies. As is detectable in the detail at center, the woman's, or might be detectable depending on the quality of the image, the woman's head, umbrella, and magazine are collaged elements that were cut and pasted onto the drawing. The magazine is the only element of the study that was not done by hand. It is a photomechanically printed cutout of a Harper's cover, and it's small, so it was likely excised from a printed ad for the magazine. The collaged elements supply details such as the miniature Harper's logo, but they also serve as a practical tool in working out the design of the composition. In the detail at right of the lower left-hand corner of the study, you see here the printer's notes indicating the 4 colors needed to print the poster: sepia, scarlet vermilion, black, and yellow. The poster designs of Will H. Bradley were just as influential as Penfield's. Bradley was one of the few prominent poster artists of this period who trained as a printmaker, and the style, subjects, and palettes that distinguish his work bear the evidence of a printer's approach to the medium. He designed his posters with efficiency and cost in mind, notably by limiting the number of color plates needed in their production and creating additional tones through the overlapping of color plates. So for example, in the poster at left for the avant-garde magazine, The Chapbook, this poster was produced using a red plate and a green plate, and the dark, kind of near black tone that composes the women's hats and the trim of their dresses, as well as the black tone, as well as the most of the letters that spell out chapbook. Those were produced by overlapping the red and green plates. And the same concept goes for the poster on the right, wherein the orange and blue are combined to create a similarly dark, kind of almost like an eggplant tone. So beyond his clever use of colors, several of Bradley's works also allude to the art of printmaking in their subject matter. Each of these examples features a pair of identical figures, and in the example at the right, the discrepancy in scale between the two figures might be a clever nod to the newfound ease of reducing and enlarging an image using new printing technologies, so essentially scaling up and down. Bradley's repetition, mirroring, and scaling of forms demonstrate a clever play on printmaking tropes that calls the viewer's attention to how works were made. I'll take questions at the end. Bradley is credited with helping to popularize Art Nouveau graphic design in the United States. After making a name for himself through his chapbook posters, he established his own press and monthly art and literary magazine called Bradley His Book. The peacock is a common motif of Art Nouveau, admired for its exotic beauty and its jewel tones, and one that appears in dozens of literary posters from this period, such as the one seen here by Bradley, as well as the artist Louis John Reed at right. Bradley's poster for an 1895 issue of the Chapbook features a mythical red-haired pan figure playing a reed flute within a lush vegetal setting. and it seems to have directly inspired the artist Florence Lundberg's poster for the August 1896 issue of a magazine called The Lark, which was a California-based magazine, a Northern California-based magazine that was devoted to experimental art and literature. And Bradley was a big fan of The Lark. It was a kind of avant-garde magazine with a very small run, and it folded after only 2 years. And following its brief run, Bradley wrote that the ending of the publication, quote, snapped one of the threads which bound San Francisco in a literary way to the rest of the world. And so that just gives you a sense of the kind of mutual admiration that these artists had for one another's work, but also for the engagement that they had with the content of the magazines that they illustrated for. The Lark was a so-called little magazine, which is a term used to describe, or was a term used to describe magazines with experimental content and a small circulation, as I just mentioned. And Lundberg illustrated many of the magazine's posters and often reflected the magazine's regional focus, as seen in this example here for the November 1895 issue, which she made using woodcut rather than the standard techniques of lithography and relief printing. And interestingly, Lundberg cut the wood blocks herself, and so she both designed this poster but also produced it, achieving simplified forms and broad areas of unmodulated color that were characteristic of the arts and crafts movement in Northern California. And so the poster depicts the Marin Peninsula just north of San Francisco. So in terms of both the subject matter depicted, but also the style and the technique, she is engaging with the kind of art, the contemporary art scene of her region of Northern California. And The Lark, I should mention, was a magazine that was devoted to the arts and literature of that area. As literary posters gained increasing popularity among the public over the course of the 1890s, some publishing houses took to organizing poster design contests that were integral to kickstarting young illustrators' careers. One example is Joseph Christian Leyendecker, who won first prize in the Centuries contest for an ad for its 1896 Midsummer issue. His lavish ode to the abundance of nature, which you see at left, features a woman with gold hair surrounded by poppies. And if you come to the exhibition at the Met, you'll see that, take a close look at this poster, the hair and other elements are printed in metallic ink, so you really get a sense of the, the kind of lush quality of the ink. And at right is Maxfield Parrish's work. Parrish submitted his whimsical composition of a young nude figure gazing skyward and lost in thought to the contest of the same year. And he allegedly won second prize rather than first, even though it was the judge's favorite, because the contest rules stipulated that all submissions must enable printing in 3 colors maximum, but the printing of his poster required 4. So they gave him second prize rather than first prize. But nonetheless, they issued this poster for the Midsummer Fiction number the following year. And this publication of this poster really helped to cement Parrish's reputation, as a leading artist of fantasy and escapism, and it really kickstarted his career as well. So you see these poster competitions, how they made a major impact on the careers of young illustrators and artists. In the late 19th century, many women artists found new professional opportunities in poster and book illustration. Publishers often commissioned women to illustrate their children's books, as children's books were believed to be particularly well-suited to the temperament of women artists. And the artist Blanche McManus Mansfield is an example of someone who not only illustrated the book titled The True Mother Goose, but she also wrote it. So she's the author and illustrator, and she designed the poster advertising it. And I will say this is one of my favorites in the collection. You see how she applied contrasting shades of white and black to the flock of geese, seen flying over a cityscape to achieve the appearance of juxtaposed positive and negative images, affecting a compelling kind of decorative composition. So she's, I think, an example of one of the women artists from this period who took both advantage of new professional opportunities, but also kind of pushed against the limits that were still placed against women illustrators by endeavoring in both illustrating, writing, and promoting the book using her talents and skills. Like McManus Mansfield, Ethel Reed received several commissions to illustrate children's books and posters to promote them. In her advertisement for Arabella and Araminta stories, she depicts the twin sister protagonists of the book's title as mirror images of each other, with their dresses joined together to create one flat black mass. Contemporary critics called her work strange and mysterious, and one wrote that, quote, "The likeness to nature is as far removed as possible, and decoration is triumphant." And I read that quote as an allusion to the artist's engagement with Art Nouveau and the arts and crafts movement and other artistic trends of the period that foregrounded the decorative. And something I really love about this work is that it promotes a children's book, but it's very kind of haunting and a little unsettling. So she was really also pushing the boundaries there. To advertise the novel Miss Traumerei at Wright, Reed depicted the title character playing piano, a reference to the story's plot and a popular leisure activity among upper and middle class women during this period. And her upswept hairstyle and plunging low-backed dress accentuate her bare shoulders and neck. And so although she's portrayed in this sensuous manner, she's also absorbed in her practice, and she's oblivious to the viewer's gaze. And she's a representation of the new woman who was both the subject and the consumer of the novels that posters like this one promoted. One of the reasons that so many literary posters survive today, many of them in near pristine condition, is that they were popular with poster collectors from the outset. While the posters were intended to be installed in shop windows, on building facades, and on billboards, collectors often scooped them up before they were able to be displayed and kept them safely stored. And the immense popularity of these posters among collectors in the 1890s ultimately led to the genre's demise. The posters were, in fact, often more coveted as collectibles than the magazines, newspapers, and books that they advertised, thus failing to increase sales for the issuing publishing firms. So in other words, they failed as advertisements. By the late 1890s, many publishers shifted focus and directed their resources towards compelling book bindings and magazine covers, frequently commissioning the artists of literary posters who adopted their aesthetic approaches to the book and magazine cover format. So if you've noticed, I'm just going to go back here for a moment, in some of these examples where figures are actually holding magazines in the image, the covers are pretty boring. They really only include text, advertising with the magazine's title and information about the contents. So these posters existed in a moment before publishers had the idea to actually commission artists to design interesting and alluring magazine covers and book covers. Oops, I went the wrong way. Well, now you get to see all the images again. Okay. Ethel Reed, again, whose binding design for Arabella and Araminta stories is at Wright, was among the first illustrators to actually apply a consistent style to her book illustrations and bindings. You see the binding here, the front and back cover, and the spine at Wright, as well as the posters that advertise them. So you can see this is a good example of that kind of consistency in styles between the two. So though the popularity of literary posters was ultimately short-lived, they had a lasting lasting just under a decade, they had a lasting impact on the evolution of illustration, graphic design, and marketing in the United States. And I will say as an aside, often when I meet a designer or graphic designer or an illustrator who studies the history of their field, many of these posters come up in conversation as major inspirations. The impact really continues to last to today. Now, before I conclude, I'd like to encourage you all to see the exhibition, The Art of the Literary Poster, works from the Leonard A. Lauder Collection, which will be on view at the Met, again, from March 7th through June 11th, and to check out the related book, which will be available actually in just a few days at the Met shop. Please come see the show and purchase the book if you can. And thank you all very much for the opportunity to present today. And we have time for questions, so happy to take your question.
Thanks. Yes, hi. I actually have several, but first, when you talk about relief printing, what type are you talking about? Letterpress or what?
There is some letterpress, and
woodcut would be relief too, right?
That's true. Now, this gets very complicated, and I will admit that we have in the book and in the exhibition labels used the terms relief printing because it is often difficult to make out exactly what kind of techniques are being used in the posters. There were so many new and there were many experiments going on in the printing, actually. And my colleague at the Met, Rachel Mustalish, who is a paper conservator, wrote an essay for the book about the complexities of the print processes. It was a revelation to both of us how sophisticated and complex the production or the techniques that went into these posters were. And as a curator of this material, it was something I've been searching for a long time, a kind of thorough but accessible explanation of how these posters were made. And so we did it, we produced it. And so all to say that we use the terms lithography, relief printing, and woodcut in the book because many times you can tell that there's relief printing present, but it is often impossible to untangle the various different approaches used. But I encourage you to read the essay, really. It breaks it all apart. Yeah.
I will buy the book. And also, I have the other book, the Keel, which I think is sort of the predecessor to this one.
Yes.
How has the collection evolved, or the knowledge about literary posters since the publication of Keel?
Yeah, thank you. So the Keel book, what he's referring to is. I mentioned that the collection began at the Met in 1984 when Mr. Lauder donated roughly, I think, 160 of these posters to the museum. And a few years later, in 1987, the Met organized an exhibition around the posters and published a book. And the book, which was written and edited by David Keel, the curator of this material at the time, has become a kind of almost like a Bible for scholars and curators and researchers of this material. It functions as a kind of catalogue raisonné in a way of the literary posters that were known. So I'll answer that question in two ways. One is the book that that we're publishing this year provides many reproductions and information about posters that have been acquired since then. As I mentioned, the collection now numbers over 500 works, and so Mr. Lauder has, for over the last 40 years, continued to support the museum's acquisition of these posters regularly. And so it's been something that the museum's been doing consistently for 4 decades. In terms of new knowledge, new information, so the book, as you will all see when you buy it, the book features four essays and a series of plates publishing highlights from the collection. The essays, one essay by my colleague Shannon Vittoria is about the subject of women illustrators, which I touched on very briefly, the ways in which the new field of illustration that didn't really exist before enabled many women artists to become professionals for many reasons. I mean, she outlines, for example, how women could make drawings at home that they could just, mail in to the publishing firms to reproduce. So with the limitations that they had, in that sense, it was a kind of a way into that career. And she talks too about the kind of merging of book illustration and poster illustration, those two fields, and how that played into the professionalization of women. Another essay talks about, fascinating essay by my colleague Jennifer Greenhill about early experiments into and research into the psychology of marketing and how that played a role, and the ways in which these poster artists were attuned to that research. And so I call these art posters, many of us call these art posters because there are so many resonances with, contemporary art movements. But at the same time, these artists were very engaged with, research on marketing. And so that's another essay. And then the essay I mentioned earlier by my colleague Rachel Mustalish goes into the nitty-gritty of the techniques and processes. That's a long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of new information in this book, and we strove to use new research, but also I would say new kind of perspectives or art historical approaches that have emerged in the last 40 years and applied them to the study of this material, and that's really, I think, what makes it, in my mind, a vital contribution to the literature on the subject. If
Hi.
I may say so. Where am I looking? Hello. Hi.
Thank you very much. The work looks wonderful. I'm looking forward to the show. I have
Thank
2
you.
questions. I don't know whether you can get into the details of it, but maybe it's in the book. The first one is the Hoppers
Yeah.
in Penfield. He was the art director, the artist, and he did soup to nuts. My question is, did he also design the font,
Yes.
or
good-
did they
good question.
use a font that was popular at the time?
Let's go back again. Great question. Yes, so he was art director, artist, soup to nuts. And yes, this is his font. And as I mentioned, he's drawing the text. I didn't mention this in any depth. I didn't talk about this in any depth, but he's drawing the lettering onto the plate or the stone that he's working with. So it's integrated into the image. It's all he's creating it all at once. And on that note,
That style was popular in 18.
Yes. So it wasn't.
I was thinking maybe he took
I see what you're
something
saying.
off the shelf, or
I see what you're saying. Yes, it wasn't. He wasn't someone who was creating a new font and calling it his own in the way that someone like Will Bradley did. Will Bradley was. Oh gosh, I did it again. I'm sorry. Will Bradley was someone who did create his own fonts that are still in use today by certain typeface, it's called the Will Bradley font. So yes, I should distinguish between what Penfield was doing, which was kind of looking at existing fonts and just kind of taking inspiration in a way, doing the font by hand, versus Bradley, who I mentioned was trained as a printmaker. He designed fonts. He approached design in a different way, I would say, than Penfield. Penfield was a draftsman, and Bradley was someone who was printing his own work as well, not only designing it. So they kind of represent two different approaches to illustration, or I guess you could call it graphic design during the period.
And my other question has to do with the fact that the posters and Reed especially went beyond posters as advertising into books.
Yes.
And I noticed 1895, do you have any idea what $2 was worth? Because who could buy a book for $2?
You could probably Google it.
When 1895,
Yeah.
that was like a week's wage.
I mean, so the books, but also the magazines, Harper's and Lippincott's, were, targeted towards an audience of means. You didn't buy a book or a magazine unless you had the time and the luxury of time to sit and read a book in a magazine. So it was really targeted towards a certain audience, though I would say that many of the posters were still appealed to a broad, almost mainstream audience. But yes, you're touching on an important point, which is that, I talked a bit about leisure scenes. Playing the piano, for example, that's something that a leisure activity that women partook in if they had. It was mostly, a leisure activity reserved for the middle and upper classes. And so by engaging the imagery and the subjects of the kinds of activities and the kinds of lives that the target audience for these posters led, they work in tandem, if that makes sense. And so you bring up a good point about the cost of the book, because it does tell you something about the audience.
You said that as an advertising, it failed because people liked the posters more and they collected them.
Collectors did.
So their target audience, not only did they not get the target audience, but they didn't get the posters either. And the book cost $2.
Yeah.
Is there any way of finding out? I guess we could.
Finding out what exactly?
What $2 was worth
Oh.
in 1895?
Anyone have their phone? $74.
$74.
It's really
Who could buy a
expensive.
$74 book
It's a good
today?
point. It's a good point. But the fact that these were so alluring that collectors couldn't keep their hands off of them, which meant that they weren't in circulation the way that they were meant to be, and thus failed as advertisements, is a kind of fascinating, fascinating circumstances in a way, because they were so good that they didn't work. They didn't do what they were meant. They didn't function the way they were meant to function. But it did this. That led to this shift, as I mentioned, that occurred where publishers shifted from pouring their resources into posters to instead hiring illustrators to design book covers and magazine covers. And that's where where we get, that's obviously a practice that's still in use. And so that's how that shift occurred. Yeah. Did I answer your question sufficiently? Great. Any other questions? Sure.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about newspaper posters, advertising, newspapers?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't include any posters for newspapers in the presentation. I don't want to make a gross kind of generalization here, but for the most part, because newspapers came out daily rather than monthly, they were done more quickly and more cheaply, and maybe didn't have the same kind of they weren't of the same kind of quality for the most part. There's obviously exceptions, and there's, many of the posters that advertise, that, the artists who were commissioned to advertise newspapers were also doing, advertisements for these magazines that we see in the presentation. But I do think that comes into play, and you can get a sense not only of the kind of it's more about the quality of the printing, the quality of the paper. That really does make a difference in the way that you kind of receive the image. And so when working on this exhibition and this book, I mentioned I work closely with my colleague, a paper conservator, and she does write about this in her essay, how in looking, under the microscope at these posters, you can see just how sloppily the posters for the newspapers were printed versus how much time and, how much time really was put into the printing of the posters for magazines. And I do think that the crunch time makes a huge difference in the way that they were produced and the way that they were received. We will have a few examples by artists like Ernest Haskell comes to mind, who were very prominent illustrators during the period, who were commissioned for to make advertisements for newspapers. But yeah, there's a difference in quality, absolutely. So the question was, were Americans using the same kind of steam-pressured presses that the French were using at this time? Now, I talked a little bit in the presentation about one of the kind of major differences between the circus posters, for example, that came before, and these literary posters was the way in which they were printed, the places in which they were printed. And so the Barnum posters for, the circus posters that we looked at, many of those were printed in big, major lithography firms where, these firms were just churning out these posters one by one. Whereas I think, one of the insights you get from the Penfield study that I showed is how closely, how closely Penfield, the illustrator, and the printers, or at least those who are translating his designs for the printers, worked, because you have what we suspect is annotations, as I mentioned, by the printer on a drawing by Penfield. And of course, as I've talked about too, Penfield was in-house. He was the art director of Harper's, where the posters were being produced. And so we think that when it comes to Harper's and Lippincott's and these bigger publishing firms, or at least the firms where these major magazines were printed, they were being printed in-house. So you have a kind of collapse where the designs aren't being sent out to big firms to be printed. It's all happening in-house. And I do think that accounts for a lot of the its quality control. And I think that made a big impact on the, on just the, evolution really of these posters. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.